announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
In the early hours before dawn, somewhere beyond the visible curve of the Caribbean horizon, one of the most powerful warships ever built cut silently through black water. The USS George Washington, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier the size of a floating city, was operating in contested waters amid rising tensions with Venezuela. Officially, it was a routine deployment. Unofficially, intelligence reports had warned of something far more dangerous. Coastal missile batteries on high alert, fighter squadrons dispersed to hardened shelters, and encrypted communications traffic spiking along Venezuela's northern coast. For days, American surveillance aircraft had traced unusual movements. Mobile launch platforms repositioned under cover of darkness, radar systems cycling in irregular patterns, naval patrol craft pushing farther out to sea than usual. Then came the final signal. A thermal bloom detected by satellite, a launch signature. Seconds later, the Aegis combat systems aboard the carrier strike group lit up with confirmation. Multiple fast-moving contacts, sea skimming, inbound. What happened next unfolded in less than 4 minutes. On the bridge of the George Washington, klaxons cut through the hum of machinery. Pilots sprinted toward ready aircraft as deck crews scrambled to clear the flight line. Escorting destroyers pivoted hard to bring their radar arrays and missile batteries to bear. The first defensive interceptors roared skyward, guided by targeting data shared across the strike group's network. Electronic warfare teams flooded the spectrum with jamming signals, attempting to blind and confuse the incoming weapons. Some of the missiles vanished in mid-air, destroyed far beyond visual range. Others pressed on, weaving low over the waves, exploiting the curvature of the earth and the clutter of the sea. For a brief moment, the outcome hung in the balance. One leak in the defensive shield could mean catastrophic damage, fire on the flight deck, or worse. But this confrontation was not simply about hardware. It was about doctrine, readiness, and political brinkmanship. Venezuela's military had invested heavily in asymmetric strategies designed to challenge larger naval powers. Coastal defense systems, long-range anti-ship missiles, and advanced air defenses were meant to deter exactly this kind of projection of force. The United States, meanwhile, had refined layered missile defense and rapid strike capabilities over decades of global operations. As the final intercept detonated in a flash above the waterline, shockwaves rippled across the surface of the sea. Smoke trails drifted in the humid Caribbean air. The immediate threat had been neutralized, yet the night was far from over. Within minutes, American aircraft were airborne, armed and fueled. Submarines repositioned silently beneath the surface. Targeting solutions were calculated against radar installations and suspected launch sites along the coast. The decision now facing commanders was stark: contain the incident or escalate. This was not a war declared in headlines. It was a confrontation measured in seconds, defined by technology, and shaped by decisions made under extreme pressure. How close did the world come to a wider conflict? What systems held, and which nearly failed? And what does this clash reveal about the evolving balance of power in the Western Hemisphere? Tonight, we break down the timeline, the tactics, and the stakes of a battle that almost changed the strategic map of the Americas. In the days leading up to the confrontation, the USS George Washington was operating in the southern Caribbean Sea, officially as part of a scheduled maritime security deployment under U.S. Fourth Fleet oversight. The carrier, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered warship capable of sustaining flight operations for months without refueling, had entered the region amid heightened political tension between Washington and Caracas. Publicly, U.S. officials described the mission as a freedom of navigation operation combined with joint exercises alongside regional partners. Privately, intelligence briefings painted a far more volatile picture. Venezuela's northern coastline, stretching along the Caribbean, is strategically significant. Major population centers and military infrastructure are concentrated there, including naval facilities near Puerto Cabello and air bases capable of supporting advanced fighter aircraft. In recent years, Venezuela had invested in layered air defenses, including Russian-supplied S-300VM surface-to-air missile systems designed to deter high-altitude incursions. Coastal defense doctrine emphasized anti-access and area denial strategies, intended to complicate operations by larger naval powers operating offshore. While the Venezuelan Navy is modest compared to that of the United States, its defensive posture relies on land-based systems, mobile missile platforms, and combat aircraft such as the Su-30 Mk2, which are capable of carrying anti-ship weapons. In the week before the incident, U.S. surveillance assets reportedly detected unusual activity along the Venezuelan coast. Satellite imagery showed mobile radar units repositioning closer to the shoreline. Signals intelligence aircraft operating in international airspace intercepted encrypted communications traffic at a significantly higher volume than baseline patterns. American analysts assessed that Venezuelan forces had shifted to an elevated state of readiness, though not yet to full wartime posture. Fighter squadrons were dispersed from their primary hangars to secondary revetments, a standard precautionary move designed to reduce vulnerability to preemptive strikes. Naval patrol vessels increased their presence beyond territorial waters, tracking commercial shipping lanes and shadowing foreign warships at a distance. Meanwhile, the George Washington Carrier Strike Group maintained a layered defensive formation. In addition to the carrier itself, the group included guided missile destroyers equipped with the Aegis combat system, capable of tracking and engaging multiple airborne threats simultaneously. A guided missile cruiser operated as an air defense commander, integrating radar data across the task force. Beneath the surface, at least one fast attack submarine provided unseen reconnaissance and deterrence. Overhead, E-2D Advanced Hawkeye aircraft conducted airborne early warning patrols, extending the strike group's radar horizon far beyond what shipboard systems alone could achieve. Officially, the carrier's air wing was engaged in routine flight operations, training sorties, deck qualifications, and interoperability drills with partner nations. Unofficially, pilots were briefed on contingency strike packages targeting hypothetical coastal radar sites and missile batteries. Maintenance crews worked extended shifts to ensure that aircraft designated for suppression of enemy air defenses were mission-ready on short notice. Rules of engagement were reviewed and clarified, emphasizing defensive posture while allowing commanders discretion to respond to imminent threats. What added to the tension was a closed-door briefing in Caracas, reportedly delivered to senior Venezuelan commanders 2 nights before the crisis. According to later accounts from regional intelligence sources, the presentation included simulations demonstrating the theoretical engagement envelope of coastal missile systems against a carrier operating within 200 nautical miles of shore. Although such exercises are common in military planning, the timing raised alarms in Washington. U.S. analysts debated whether this was routine deterrent signaling or preparation for a limited demonstration of force. Weather conditions also played a subtle but critical role. The Caribbean that week was marked by heavy humidity, intermittent squalls, and low cloud ceilings at dawn and dusk, conditions that can complicate radar detection and flight operations. Sea states remained moderate, but shifting thermal layers over the water created variable radar propagation, occasionally producing false contacts or masking low-flying objects. For both sides, environmental factors added an element of uncertainty to already strained calculations. By the final evening before the engagement, the George Washington had adjusted its operating box slightly eastward, remaining in international waters but within a distance that allowed rapid air operations over key maritime approaches. Venezuelan coastal radar emissions increased in frequency and duration, suggesting continuous tracking of the strike group. Neither side had fired a shot. Diplomatic channels remained open but tense. On paper, it was a standoff defined by posturing and deterrence. In reality, it was a tightly wound confrontation in which a single misinterpreted signal, a radar glitch, or an overzealous commander could ignite events far beyond anyone's initial intent. Shortly after 4:17 local time, the first indication that the standoff had shifted from tension to action did not come from a lookout scanning the horizon, but from a satellite cue relayed through secure channels to the carrier strike group. A U.S. early warning satellite detected a brief but intense infrared flare along Venezuela's northern coastline, consistent with the launch profile of a solid-fuel missile booster. Within seconds, the data was pushed to regional command and cross-checked against airborne sensors. Almost simultaneously, an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye orbiting at altitude picked up anomalous radar returns rising from low elevation near the coast before dipping back towards sea level. The geometry suggested sea-skimming trajectories, the kind designed specifically to reduce reaction time for naval defenses. Aboard the USS George Washington, the Combat Information Center shifted from routine tracking to full alert in a matter of heartbeats. The SPY-1 radar arrays on the escorting Aegis destroyers began refining tracks, filtering out sea clutter and false returns caused by the humid pre-dawn atmosphere. Within 20 seconds, operators had classified multiple inbound contacts traveling at high subsonic speed, hugging the surface at an estimated altitude of less than 15 meters. Their projected flight paths converged toward the carrier's formation. Whether they had been launched from mobile coastal batteries or aircraft operating beyond the radar horizon was not immediately clear, but the speed and profile were consistent with modern anti-ship cruise missiles. Klaxons sounded through the passageways of the carrier, a harsh metallic alarm that cut through the steady background hum of turbines and ventilation systems. "General quarters! General quarters! All hands man your battle stations!" Sailors moved with rehearsed precision. Flight deck crews secured loose equipment and began clearing the landing area. Aircraft in various states of readiness were either chalked and chained or prepared for rapid launch depending on evolving orders. On the bridge, the officer of the deck received confirmation from the strike group commander. This was not a drill. The first tactical assessment estimated the missile's time to impact at under 4 minutes. At sea-skimming altitude, radar detection ranges are compressed by the curvature of the Earth, meaning defenders often have only minutes, or less, to respond. The escorts adjusted course slightly to optimize radar coverage and engagement geometry, presenting their missile batteries toward the inbound tracks. Electronic warfare teams activated jamming suites, attempting to disrupt potential active radar seekers guiding the weapons in their terminal phase. Intelligence analysts later suggested that at least one of the missiles matched the performance envelope of export-class anti-ship systems known to be in regional inventories, capable of traveling at approximately Mach 0.8 and programmed for evasive terminal maneuvers. There were also unconfirmed reports that one launcher had been mounted on a mobile platform concealed within a coastal industrial zone, a tactic intended to complicate attribution and counter-strike planning. What heightened anxiety on the American side was the possibility that the launch was coordinated with off-board targeting data, perhaps from coastal over-the-horizon radar or maritime patrol aircraft, providing real-time updates to the missiles mid-flight. Inside the Combat Information Center, operators watched the green-lit displays as threat symbols inched closer. Automatic engagement protocols were reviewed but not fully relinquished to the system. Commanders retained manual oversight to avoid misidentification. The decision to engage was made swiftly once trajectory confirmation eliminated the possibility of a navigational anomaly or civilian aircraft misclassification. Authorization codes were transmitted, and the first interceptor missiles were selected for launch from the escorting destroyers. For a brief and unnerving moment, one of the inbound tracks flickered and disappeared from radar, likely masked by sea clutter or executing a programmed maneuver. The temporary loss generated immediate concern that the defensive window was narrowing. Additional sensors were tasked, and cross-queuing between ships stabilized the track within seconds. But the episode underscored how quickly uncertainty can compound in real time. On the flight deck, a pair of F/A-18 Super Hornets sat armed but idle, their pilots strapped in and awaiting either a launch order or confirmation that shipboard defenses would suffice. The final minute before intercept was marked not by chaos, but by controlled intensity. Orders were clipped and precise. Damage control teams stood ready below decks, anticipating the worst even as defenses engaged. In those compressed seconds, the abstract tension of geopolitics transformed into a tangible countdown measured in nautical miles and closing speeds. Whatever the strategic calculations had been days earlier, the moment of launch had reduced them to a single urgent objective: stop the incoming missiles before they reached the hull of the most valuable warship in the formation. As the inbound tracks closed the remaining distance, the carrier strike group shifted from detection to full defensive execution. Engagement authority had already been granted, and the outer layer of defense activated first. Guided missile destroyers positioned ahead of the carrier launched standard missile interceptors in rapid succession, their vertical launch cells erupting in controlled bursts of flame that briefly illuminated the pre-dawn darkness. Each interceptor climbed steeply before arcing toward calculated intercept points, guided by continuous radar illumination and mid-course updates transmitted through the Aegis network. The geometry of the formation mattered. By placing the escorts between the threat axis and the carrier, commanders maximized engagement depth, forcing the incoming missiles to run a gauntlet of layered fire. Electronic warfare systems intensified their output, saturating the electromagnetic spectrum with noise and deceptive signals intended to break missile locks or seduce them away from the carrier's radar cross-section. Decoy launchers fired off-board countermeasures, small, hovering devices designed to mimic the radar signature of a large vessel. For several tense seconds, tracking data suggested at least one inbound weapon had shifted slightly off its original course, possibly reacting to jamming or a decoy bloom. Whether that deviation was intentional or the result of terminal maneuver programming was impossible to determine in real time, but it bought precious moments. The first intercept occurred well beyond visual range, confirmed by the sudden disappearance of a hostile track and a brief spike in debris signatures. A second followed shortly after. However, not all intercept attempts were clean. One standard missile detonated close to its target, but failed to produce an immediate kill indication. The inbound contact continued, though its speed fluctuated, suggesting damage. At this point, the engagement transitioned to the inner defensive ring. Additional interceptors were launched, this time optimized for shorter-range engagement, while the carrier itself adjusted course at flank speed, presenting a narrower aspect and complicating terminal targeting solutions. As the remaining missiles descended into their final approach windows, close-in weapon systems across the formation came to readiness. The distinctive whine of radar-directed Gatling guns spooling up carried across open decks. Sailors who could not see the threat could feel the vibration of systems shifting into maximum output. One inbound missile broke through the outer intercept envelope and was engaged at medium range by a final defensive salvo. The detonation occurred low over the water, sending a shockwave across the surface and scattering fragments that splashed harmlessly short of the formation. Another contact vanished abruptly after electronic countermeasures peaked, likely having lost guidance and impacted the sea. The culmination of the attack came in a narrow window measured in seconds rather than minutes. One damaged missile, its guidance apparently degraded but still airborne, emerged from sea clutter at an oblique angle relative to the carrier's starboard bow. It was engaged simultaneously by a point defense missile and a close-in weapon system from an escorting destroyer. The sky briefly lit with intersecting tracer streams and a sharp white flash. Debris rained into the water less than a mile from the outer perimeter of the formation. For a heartbeat afterward, radar screens were crowded with secondary returns, shrapnel, sea spray, and residual clutter, forcing operators to carefully discriminate between actual threats and phantom echoes. Then, gradually, the displays cleared. No active inbound tracks remained. Silence did not follow. Instead, the strike group pivoted immediately into counteraction planning. Even as damage control teams confirmed no impacts had occurred and medical stations reported no casualties, targeting cells began compiling data to identify the precise origin of the launch. Earlier intelligence had narrowed possible sites to a handful of coastal sectors. Now, trajectory backtracking refined those assessments to specific grid coordinates. Signals intelligence assets detected residual emissions consistent with mobile radar systems, briefly activating and then shutting down, an indication that launch crews were attempting to relocate. Within minutes, aircraft previously held on alert were airborne. Strike packages configured for suppression of enemy air defenses accelerated toward the coast under the protection of electronic attack platforms. Their mission was not broad retaliation, but focused neutralization of confirmed launch infrastructure. Concurrently, a guided missile submarine operating in support received updated targeting solutions for land attack cruise missiles, should escalation require standoff strikes beyond the reach of carrier-based aviation. The decision threshold was delicate. Respond forcefully enough to deter further launches, but calibrated to avoid uncontrolled escalation. As American aircraft approached the littoral zone, they encountered increased radar activity from Venezuelan air defense networks. Pilots reported intermittent targeting indications, suggesting tracking but not immediate engagement. Electronic warfare aircraft responded by degrading radar performance, creating corridors through which strike fighters could operate with reduced exposure. In one instance, a suspected mobile launcher convoy was identified moving along a coastal highway. A pair of precision-guided munitions were released, striking the lead vehicle and forcing the remainder to scatter. Secondary explosions were observed, consistent with the destruction of missile components, though full battle damage assessment would take hours. Simultaneously, naval aviation assets conducted shows of force over designated maritime zones, reinforcing the message that additional launches would be met with rapid and decisive action. There were no immediate counterstrikes from the Venezuelan side. Whether due to damage inflicted on launch capabilities, internal command hesitation, or deliberate de-escalation remains subject to later analysis. What is clear is that the initial attack had failed to achieve its intended objective, and the strike group retained full operational capacity. By sunrise, the tactical picture had stabilized. The carrier's flight deck resumed controlled operations, though at heightened alert status. Escorting ships maintained expanded patrol arcs, anticipating the possibility of follow-on attempts. Intelligence analysts worked to correlate radar logs, infrared signatures, and electronic intercepts into a coherent timeline that could support both military planning and diplomatic communication. Casualty reports were negative on the American side, and no structural damage had been sustained. On shore, however, at least 2 launch sites were assessed as destroyed or rendered inoperable, and coastal radar coverage in the affected sector appeared degraded. The broader implications extended beyond the immediate exchange. The engagement demonstrated both the resilience of layered naval defense and the inherent risk of operating within range of modern coastal missile systems. It underscored how rapidly a regional standoff can escalate into direct combat, even in the absence of a declared war. Commanders on both sides had been forced to make split-second decisions with strategic consequences. For the United States, the successful defense reinforced confidence in integrated air and missile defense doctrine, while validating the necessity of maintaining escort depth and electronic warfare superiority. For Venezuela, the failed strike, if officially acknowledged, would likely prompt reassessment of targeting methods, survivability of mobile launchers, and the political calculus of deterrence signaling. In the end, the confrontation did not expand into a sustained campaign, but it left an indelible mark on regional security dynamics. The night's events were dissected in classified briefings and quiet diplomatic exchanges, serving as a stark reminder that in modern naval warfare, the distance between posturing and open conflict can collapse in a matter of minutes. By the time the immediate crisis had passed and the last aircraft returned to the carrier's deck, the confrontation had already entered a different phase: assessment, messaging, and strategic recalibration. Tactically, the United States emerged without losses. As previously described, no missile had struck the carrier or its escorts, and no American personnel were killed or injured during the engagement. That outcome reinforced long-standing confidence in layered naval, air, and missile defense systems, particularly the integration of shipborne radar networks, interceptor missiles, electronic warfare, and coordinated command structures. Analysts within the strike group concluded that reaction times, engagement sequencing, and cross-ship data sharing had functioned within expected parameters, though internal reviews reportedly identified minor latency issues in sensor fusion during the most compressed moments of the attack. On the Venezuelan side, the picture was more complex. Post-strike reconnaissance and signals analysis suggested that at least 2 coastal launch units had been destroyed or rendered inoperable during the American counteraction. Satellite imagery taken within 24 hours reportedly showed scorched terrain and damaged support vehicles near one suspected launch corridor. There were unconfirmed regional reports of casualties among Venezuelan military personnel, though official statements from Caracas framed the events as a defensive readiness exercise and denied any significant material losses. The lack of transparent acknowledgement contributed to an information battle that unfolded alongside the military exchange, with both sides carefully shaping public narratives to avoid uncontrolled escalation. Strategically, the clash underscored the vulnerability of high-value naval assets operating within the engagement envelope of modern anti-ship systems, even when supported by robust defenses. While the carrier strike group had successfully repelled the attack, internal U.S. Navy evaluations reportedly emphasized that saturation attacks involving larger missile salvos could present more complex challenges. As a result, recommendations were circulated to adjust future operating distances in similar geopolitical contexts and to increase reliance on distributed maritime operations, a doctrine that disperses combat power across multiple platforms to complicate enemy targeting. Politically, the incident triggered urgent diplomatic activity. Within hours, back-channel communications were opened through regional intermediaries to clarify intent and reduce the risk of follow-on engagements. Senior defense officials characterized the U.S. response as measured and proportional, emphasizing that the counterstrikes had targeted only confirmed military infrastructure directly linked to the launch. Behind closed doors, however, policymakers debated whether the initial attack had been authorized at the highest levels of Venezuelan command or initiated by regional commanders operating under ambiguous rules of engagement. Regionally, neighboring states expressed concern about the rapid escalation and the proximity of advanced weapon systems to major shipping routes. Insurance rates for commercial vessels transiting parts of the southern Caribbean briefly spiked amid fears of miscalculation. International observers noted that even a limited exchange between a global naval power and a coastal state could disrupt economic stability far beyond the immediate theater. In military academies and strategic think tanks, the confrontation quickly became a case study. It illustrated the compression of decision-making timelines in modern warfare, the central role of networked defenses, and the thin margin separating deterrence from open conflict. Ultimately, while neither side declared victory nor admitted defeat, the balance of outcomes favored the force that retained operational freedom and escalation dominance. The engagement ended not with a treaty or a ceasefire ceremony, but with a silent understanding. Both sides had tested the edge, and both had glimpsed how easily it could give way.